Hello, Jonathan Hetterly here, and today I'm going to be discussing the psychological themes found in the new Ryan Gosling film, First Man. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I review and discuss the themes found in the films that I watch and love. But before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way you'll never miss out on our videos that explore the intersection of psychology and pop culture. Now what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go into a brief synopsis and review of the film, and then we're going to dive into the psychology of First Man. Now warning, we're going to be talking about the film, so there's spoiler alerts here. If you have not seen the film, pause this video, go check out First Man, then come back and then finish the film and let me know what you think. So this is the third film of Damien Chazelle starring Ryan Gosling and Claire Foy, and explores Neil Armstrong's ascension through NASA to become the first man to walk on the moon. I really enjoyed this film, but I have to give some disclaimers. I took my family to see this film, including my two teen daughters, and they were a little underwhelmed. In fact, I would say that the marketing of this film has really misrepresented what you see on the screen. When I saw it, I had the privilege of seeing it in IMAX, and a lot of the space scenes in that format are just mind-blowing, and Damien Chazelle knows how to use that format to full effect. But this really is a character drama. It really is an analysis of a person rather than what we probably become more accustomed to when it comes to films that explore space travel or the early days of NASA. I'm thinking about the 1980s film, The Right Stuff, based on Thomas Wolfe's book. I'm also thinking about Apollo 13, the 90s film starring Tom Hanks, directed by Ron Howard. Those films have a lot more energy. They have a lot more comedy, or they just sort of look at the folly of the men involved and all of the trials and errors that it took. This film is much more subdued. It's much more nuanced, and it really is an interior performance by Ryan Gosling. So for those of you that think you're getting a high energy type of film, you're probably going to walk away at best underwhelmed, at worst seriously disappointed. And I know some of my colleagues don't find the film as favorable as I do, but nevertheless, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I highly recommend you check it out and let me know what you think. Now, having said that, let's dive into the psychology of the film, because it really is the reason I think that I enjoyed the film as much as I did. Because in the end, First Man is not about the space program. I mean, that's sort of the environment that you find Neil Armstrong and the story taking place. But this is a case study on men and grief. First and foremost, that's what this movie is about. As a therapist that works primarily with men, I found this to be quite accurate in how men deal with emotions and grief or trauma in their own life. I've actually heard people talk about Neil Armstrong being a very quiet and by-the-book stoic type of person. Apparently that's how he is in real life, and I think Ryan Gosling really accurately represents that in his characterization. But I don't want people to automatically assume that Neil Armstrong or Ryan Gosling's depiction of Neil Armstrong and the form of masculinity that's represented in this film is merely from a bygone era. The idea of men being stoic and quite interior with their emotions is not something that's outdated.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
In fact, more of the young men that I work with, they struggle with expressing their emotions to other people and how they deal with adversity, disappointment, tragedy, pain, loss, all the things that Neil Armstrong faces in this film. Now, I originally thought this film was going to be purely about resiliency, purely about how to overcome adversity, and the trailers really show some of the scenes of like the trial and errors of the space program, and Neil sort of championing, we got to make mistakes or we have to fail here on Earth so we don't fail when we're up there. I really thought that was the film that I was walking into, and it's not the case. Sure, that's a part of the narrative, but that's not the central theme of First Man. The central theme, which I didn't realize until the movie continued to play out, happens in the first 15 minutes of the film. And that's when Neil and his wife Janet lose their young daughter to cancer. And that permeates everything about Neil Armstrong throughout the film, at least as depicted by this film and the book that it's based on. Whether or not that's a true representation, I'm going to leave that to other scholars to debate. But it's that loss of their daughter that really pushes Neil at the time to become involved in NASA's space program, and he and his wife see it as a fresh start, a new beginning. And in a lot of ways, that's what they're needing after going through such a traumatic loss. And so he gets involved in NASA, and in a lot of ways, he pours himself into work. And this is pretty common of what we know. We know men oftentimes, especially in this era, the idea of talking about grief and loss, whether it be with your spouse or whether it be with a mental health professional, it really was stigmatized back then. And if you think about Neil Armstrong being a very internalized, stoic person, that's going to even, that's really going to resonate with him even less than the average male at the time. So he pours himself into work. And it becomes both his form of escapism, it becomes a distraction. In a lot of ways, though, he just assumes that he's just doing his duty. And again, that may be more of a bygone era of a man and his duty.
Duty. Diarrhea.
It's not overly patriotic. It's really that he's good at science and mathematics and engineering, and the space program needs someone like him. He's well qualified, and so he's a natural good fit. So he's not really caught up in the rah-rah patriotism or the race to space against the Russians. He's simply doing a job. He goes to work every day, and in a lot of ways, it allows his mind to be occupied by something else other than the loss of his daughter. But we know that is simmering beneath him, and we see the first sign of this cracking when one of his friends and colleagues, as as NASA is in early development, tragically dies. And he's at the memorial, he's actually at the reception of his friend, and he can't handle it. He cannot take it to the point where he goes to his wife, played by Claire Foy, who does the most with such limited scenes, and he basically begs her it's time to leave. He can't handle this. And she, wanting to be a good friend and be compassionate and empathetic, she wants to stay there for the widow and help clean up and not leave that burden on her. Well, Neil can't handle this, and he actually just gets in his car and drives away, much to her shock and dismay. And later on, when she's getting a ride home from a couple that are really good friends of theirs, and the husband is also in the space program with Neil, basically it's revealed that he never talks about their daughter. He never talks about the grief. And this friend, played by Jason Clarke, eventually finds Neil in Neil's backyard. And Neil's just sort of looking up at the stars, and his friend basically says, hey, you really need to go be with your wife. You really need to, you don't need to be out here. You need to talk to her, especially given the way that he left the reception. And Neil, in a very matter-of-fact and even sort of emotionally muted way, basically tells his friend, do you think I left the reception because I wanted to be talking to anybody? Do you think I left because I wanted you to be here with me right now? And in a lot of ways, Neil is basically showing his cards of how he deals with intense emotions, grief, and loss. He deals with them by not dealing with them. He finds whatever he can to escape the thought of it, to occupy his mind, to distract. And his friend, just like the reception, really broke through that to where he wasn't able to kind of avoid it, and he needed to be by himself. Later on, we actually see, as he's walking with that same friend at a different time, he walks by a swing set, and he remarks that his daughter had a swing set similar to that. And then just like that, he stops talking and basically says goodnight to his friend, almost like in a mid-conversation. And again, it just shows that when his grief and the intense emotions are triggered, Neil has no coping mechanisms. In fact, his escapism is a defense, not talking about it, avoiding those emotions. And we could say again that is pretty indicative of men during that time and culture, but I would argue that's still pretty common amongst men. Where do men learn to grieve? Where do men learn to process their emotions? Now, the challenge for Neil is, as he's trying to avoid dealing with the loss and grief of his daughter, he uses his work with NASA as a form of escapism. It's his distraction. But over time, the threat of the space program and the risk starts to involve other people dying. And so even as he's trying to escape thinking about the loss of his daughter, he pours himself into his job, which only further amplifies grief and loss because some of his closest friends end up dying through the trial and errors of the early space program of NASA. So what do you do when, in trying to escape grief from one angle, you put yourself in the company of other people that you eventually lose as well? And you just see, again, Neil throughout the movie becoming more internalized, more emotionally muted. He can't handle the grief and loss, and he becomes in some ways almost obsessive in the space program. In some ways it might be because with the loss, he needs to find some level of meaning, some level of purpose, either in his friends' deaths or even in his daughter's death when he and his wife looked at NASA and the space program as their new beginning, the fresh start that they would have. Now, all this, when we think about Neil Armstrong and First Man, actually goes back to some psychology that I've discussed previously in the film Good Will Hunting when I did my Psych Cinema episode with that. And we look at this Harvard men's study. It's called the Grant Study, and it explored 70 plus years of studying men to sort of see what encapsulates a happy and meaningful life. And the number one variable that we found was loving relationships. Men that have supportive and loving relationships tend to report the highest levels of happiness and contentment in their life. But here's the other caveat, and here's really where I think it applies to Neil Armstrong, is that the Harvard men's study also highlighted that those relationships were most crucial or essential when men faced adversity in life, when they faced hardship, and they didn't push those relationships away. And you see that's what Neil does in the film. He tries to keep his wife, he tries to keep his friends at arm's length, even when he's facing hard times. He's essentially this lone maverick that's dealing with all of his repressed and building emotions, and he doesn't want anyone in, doesn't want to let anyone in, he doesn't want anyone to see that. To the point when he's about to go on his mission to the moon, it's his wife that has to confront him and basically force him to talk to their two sons about the very real possibility that he will not come home. And this is a startling scene in the film because he's basically packing up like he's just going on a business trip for a few days or a week. And his wife is basically saying, you know that there is a risk that you won't ever see your sons again. You have to talk to them about that. And he basically won't until she forces him. And it really, again, it shows how much Neil Armstrong cannot deal with loss and grief and intense emotions. Now, all of this may seem so unrelated to being the first man and landing on the moon, but the film does make a point at the end. Some might call it a little bit clunky. I'm sort of on the fence of, like, is there a payoff for all of this focus on grief and loss to Neil making it to the moon, being the first man to walk on the moon, and how those two themes or storylines connect. So there is a scene, it's just a question of whether or not you think the payoff is worth the journey there. I personally found it both moving, but maybe a little bit clunky. Again, this film is going to be pretty polarizing. It's really difficult for me to not kind of see or accept other people's criticism of the film. Again, just sort of my dealings with men and mental health and grief and loss. I found I was very immersed in the film, while other people might find it a little too sort of dull and uninspired. But hey, go check it out for yourself. Let me know what you think. And that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. So for those of you that saw First Man, what did you think? Were you captivated by the storyline and the cinematography, or did you find it a little underwhelming or disappointing? Be sure to leave your comments, but also leave me a recommendation of a film you would like for me to tackle here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and check out shrinktank.com, where you will find articles, videos, quizzes, and more that explore the intersection of pop culture and psychology. Thanks again for watching this episode of Psych Cinema. We'll see you next time.